Hi, and welcome. My name is Darrell Brown, and I am the Director of Missions at the Wichita Archer Clay Baptist Association. We're excited about this conference on James that's coming up. We hope that the material that we're providing is both engaging and thought-provoking, and actually resources our pastors to dig deeper into the book of James, to think about James in a very critical way, and to apply it to their congregation as they preach or teach through it. So let's jump right into it. So the five big questions when we come to the background on the book of James are: which James wrote the book? When was the book written? Is James really a letter? And why was the book of James written? And then who, finally, is the book of James written to? So let's start at the top of that list. Let's talk about the authorship of the book itself. And it's really a question of which James wrote. There are three men named James in the New Testament who rise to the top of the list here. You have James, the brother of John, who is one of the sons of thunder, one of the 12 apostles. You have another one of the apostles, James the Less, also known as James, the son of Alphaeus. And then you have James, the brother of Jesus, who in later church history is referred to as James the Just. So let's just kind of start with these, and let's kind of go in order kind of through these three James, and let's just talk about them for a second. Now, James, the brother of John, is killed early. We have his death recorded by Luke in Acts chapter 12. Although if you go with an early date for the book of James, as I do, then that's probably not a conclusive piece of evidence which would eliminate him from being the writer. You have this expulsion of Jewish Christians from Jerusalem in Acts chapter 8. And if that's the case, if James, the brother of John, wrote this the book of James, then it would have happened somewhere between Acts 8 and Acts 12 in that 4 or 5 year period that takes place there. Not the most likely candidate, but it's not a complete impossibility. Then when we look at James, the son of Alphaeus, we know really a lot less about James, the son of Alphaeus. He's a minor apostle. He's mentioned on a few lists. He is included in some of the events that go through there, but he's not really discussed much of a leader or as a person in the Gospels when we look at that. And then he is not really mentioned at all in the book of Acts, unless he is the James who is the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and Luke has simply neglected to put that tag on the end of his name, which the later gospel writers found it extremely necessary to do, to put the son of Alphaeus on there to distinguish him from the other James. And so a question would be, why would Luke not see it as necessary, given all of the other Jameses that are in there, to define which James that he was talking about? Now that kind of brings us down to James, the brother of Jesus. Most scholars are going to prefer this James as the author of the book of James. He is identified as one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem in the book of Acts. And given the way this particular James is mentioned in the book of Acts, he's probably not only an elder, but the chief elder, as he's mentioned first and in distinction from the rest of the elders there at the church of Jerusalem. Now, Paul also describes this James as being the one who's the leader of the church in Acts, as being the brother of Jesus in Galatians 1:19. And so unless Alphaeus, the son of Alphaeus, was a cousin of Jesus and they were using the word brother in some broad, generic, relative sense, then this is also going to exclude the son of Alphaeus as well. The strongest arguments can be made for James, the brother of Jesus. It seems to make the most logical sense, and it has the least issues. And so for this particular study, we're going to assume that this is the James who's the leader of the church in the book of Jerusalem, is James, the half-brother of Jesus, who is also the James who wrote the book of James. Now, let's talk about the date of the book. So when we talk about the date of the book of James, it's usually considered one of the earliest books in the New Testament. And there's some reasons for that. It has some undeveloped theology and not a lot of defined statements, which ecclesiology-wise, which we find in later books. But it's one of the earliest books, alongside the letter to Galatians, which interestingly enough is the book which mentions James. Now, the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15 is commonly dated around 48 to 50 AD, and it's one of the places where James is mentioned specifically. So the question then becomes whether the book of James is written before or after the Jerusalem Council. Okay? Now, since, as you guys are probably aware, in the Jerusalem Council, it generated a list of instructions for the inclusions of Gentiles into the congregation of faith. There were very specific directions on morality and idol worship and dietary laws, right? And so none of these are mentioned in the book of James, and it seems pretty logical if the James who wrote the book of James was the James of the Jerusalem Council, and he had already issued a declaration about what Gentiles should be doing in the church. Some of that information, at least, maybe not in the exact form, but some of that information would have got transferred along in his general epistle out to all of the 12 tribes, as he describes it, who are scattered abroad out there. So for all intents and purposes, we should probably assume that the book of James is written before the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. Now, the Christology of James is underdeveloped. It only mentions Jesus 2 times, and it talks about the return and expectancy for the return of the Lord to come back, but it doesn't talk about his crucifixion or the meaning of his death or his resurrection. James does seem to rely heavily on the sayings of Jesus, and some of this comes out in the podcast material as you listen to those going along chapter by chapter. But in particular, the sayings of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, and in the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, there's a lot of verbal parallels between what James says and what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. And if you think about that, if you're in a point of time in the history of the early church where there is no New Testament really yet to speak of. Again, we're talking about the first books being written in the New Testament being probably James and the book of Galatians, one from the hand of Paul and one from the hand of James. Then what they're leaning on then, as they talk about their faith in Jesus Christ as the Messiah, as the Son of God, as the one who is bringing this atoning salvation of God's gift to the world, they're leaning heavily on the sayings of Jesus. That's what they're talking about when they get together. They have the Old Testament scripture, they're looking back, they're finding prophecies that are fulfilled in the Old Testament, but they're talking about the sayings of Jesus. And we find this heavy emphasis on the sayings of Jesus kind of embedded there in the book of James in that particular sense. And so all of this feeling that it's really the sayings of Jesus which are the underlying text here that James is falling back on as he draws on his own personal faith experience also would reflect an earlier date for the book itself. Now, the focus of the teaching of the apostles on Jesus, as I said, it lays the foundation for the Gospels themselves. And again, we think the Gospels are some of the last parts of the New Testament written, particularly after those who saw and heard, Jesus in person, the eyewitnesses. After the eyewitnesses begin to pass off the scene toward the 70s and the 80s and maybe the 90s of the first century, then that's when the need for the Gospels arose. Now, James falls neatly into this period of church history when we have no church writings, New Testament writings for them to use, no organized theological structure yet, except what Paul begins to develop later on as he's planting his churches. And so James is likely written before AD 48. And probably the closest we're going to get to that is a date somewhere between 40 and 44 before this Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. So that brings us to the next question, which is James a letter? Now, there's been a lot of controversy about this. A lot of ink has been spilled over what kind of literature is James. Is it really a letter? And the truth is, apart from the opening verse of James, where he addresses this to the 12 tribes which are dispersed, the 12 tribes dispersed out there somewhere, there's nothing else really in content-wise that makes it feel like a letter. So there's no concluding remarks, there's no personal references, which if it was a general letter designed to be circulating, there wouldn't be those personal references like we find Paul writing into some of the churches that he writes to. But There's no closing to it. There's no the blessings of the Lord be upon you and from the church in Jerusalem. There's none of that kind of stuff. Now, this has caused some scholars to feel like that what we have in James is actually a sermon, okay, which kind of got recorded down and then they were going to pass it around. So they wrote that inscription to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad at the front of it before they sent it out, or that it's something, an organized block of teaching that they wanted, that the church in Jerusalem wanted to go out. And so that would be something like a diatribe. It's kind of a technical name for that, but it's an instructional teaching block. So it's not quite just a sermon. It's more intentional and thought out than just a sermon. And this was common in this time frame. Now, the reason that scholars are interested in the form of literature of James, because it helps them think what's the process from James moving from topic to topic the way that he does, because he does skip around a little bit, and this gives it some of that wisdom literature feel that you see in the book of James. But the truth is that theologically we believe that it is the Holy Spirit who's the author of the books of the New Testament. So we're going to talk about authorship. We're going to talk about the human authorship. We're going to talk about the style of literature it might be, because that might help us understand a little bit the structure of it as we go to teach through it expositionally or verse by verse, or teach through, come back and teach a key idea in the book of James. That's going to help us understand perhaps a little bit better what James was doing if we can understand the flow of the literature. Now, because it does sound like wisdom literature in the Old Testament, and because it doesn't mention Jesus except for 2 times in the entire book, this has caused some scholars to speculate whether or not James was actually a Jewish piece of literature that early Christianity grabbed and kind of retooled for their particular purposes before the New Testament came out. Now, the challenge to this, okay, is that there are ideas in the letter, in the book of James itself, which presuppose blocks of Christianity. So his whole monologue on the return of Christ and using that as an example of patience and some other things, are just some things built in which presuppose Christian theology. And the truth is that when you look at the letter itself, it's as lacking in Jewish theology as it is in Christian theology. So it doesn't talk about the feasts, it doesn't talk about the temple or sacrifices or any of those things which were, or the law, really, other than the royal law, which is kind of a broad thing where James brings that out. It's as lacking in Jewish theology as it is in Christian theology. And because it presupposes Christian theology at some key points in the letter, it's probably not likely that this started as a Jewish document. The best thing that we can say with certainty about the book of James is that it was designed to be read by a broad audience, and it was written in that sense and sent out in that sense. So when or why actually was the book of James written? What's the purpose of the book of James? It's difficult to determine this with precision, okay? Because we got 2,000 years of history between us and the book of James, but the contents of the book are the only things which are going to give us some clues as to why the book of James is written. So the recipients are obviously going through a difficult time, as all early Christians were. Okay, there wasn't anybody in this first century time who was Jewish, who had converted to faith in Christ, who was not experiencing a difficult time. And perhaps the Christians in Jerusalem had it the worst of anybody else out there. Okay, but this letter is not written per se to the church in Jerusalem. It's written to those who have been dispersed abroad in some sense. In addition to these outside issues, we see that the book of James deals with a number of inside issues. And so there was not only threats from the outside, there's some threats from the inside, which began to affect the church. Some of these are self-deception, okay? That's kind of a broad theme which keeps reappearing in the book of James. You have favoritism. You have the misuse of the tongue, and then conflict in the church. And those two, I think, are always going to be related. Where you're going to have misuse of the tongue, you're going to have conflict. and then a lack of humility. At several points, James stops to give a little bit of a monologue on the importance of humility for the person who's seeking after God. James does deal with this issue, the relationship between faith and works, and I think he wanted to stir them to works, to genuine works flowing out of their faith as he discussed this relationship. Now, practically today, the book of James helps us to not only in these areas mentioned above, but it's a reorientation, okay, to a faith that is lived out. A faith that is lived out in its entirety. And we have to understand that orthopraxy, okay, doing the right things, is as important as orthodoxy, right beliefs. So you can't just believe the right things and not live them out. You need to believe the right things, and then those need to be lived out in your life as evidence of the truthfulness that they have. Now, who is the book of James written to? Who are these dispersed Jews, the 12 tribes that he's talking about? Now, there's two possibilities that we see in the book of Acts. So you have the Jews at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, These Jews have come in for the Feast of Pentecost. It says that there were numbers of them there from all over the known world, and Luke lists 15 geographic areas, and each of these then miraculously were able to hear the gospel in their own personal tongues, and this was as part of the miracle that we see going on in Acts chapter 2. They then returned home to their countries, which were spread out to these diverse areas, and they would have had a need for some instruction. But you have another dispersion, which we've already mentioned previously, and this is the dispersion of the church in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 8. As it says there that Saul, he ravaged the church like a wild animal. He ravaged the church, and that everybody it says there fled, although it's obvious that the apostles didn't flee and some other key leaders didn't flee. But the church itself was dispersed, it says, through Judea and Samaria and outlying areas. In fact, we're going to find believers as far up the coast as in Antioch of Syria, which becomes an important part of Luke's narrative later on. Now, both of these groups, the Acts 2 group and the Acts 8 group, would have needed encouragement and support and instruction from the mother church in Jerusalem. And now the reference to the tribes scattered abroad, which is a very wide feeling, it seems a little stretched to apply that particular designation. If it was the church in Jerusalem that had just kind of moved out, we see Philip ends up in Caesarea. We see some in Samaria. He was in Samaria before in the revival there in the second half of Acts chapter 8, and then we see them up the coast a little ways, as far away as Antioch. But that seems a little bit of a stretch to say that this is the group, the 12 tribes that are dispersed abroad. Okay. On the other hand, if you have a target audience, which is Jewish Christians around Jerusalem, then the delivery and the circulation of this letter actually makes a little bit of sense. You kind of know where this letter is going to go. If this is the folks that have got dispersed into these other cities around the Judea and around Samaria, and then maybe up the seacoast a little bit, it becomes an actual deliverable letter. But when you think about the Acts 2 group again, and I'm just going to throw a map up here, and you can kind of see that these names here as they go around these geographical areas all the way over here and then come back down around the coast back this way to Cyrene. These are 15 geographical areas. You notice I've got a little red arrow up right here where Greece is not labeled, and I think Luke skips Greece because it would not have been miraculous at all for someone to have been found speaking Greek in Acts chapter 2, because pretty much everybody spoke Greek. That wouldn't have been a sign of a miracle. But other than Greece, which is marked by the area up there, all the known geographical areas where there were probably Jewish populations, synagogues, folks that had come back, are marked on this particular list. But if you think about this from Jerusalem, this little one letter from the hand of James, how in the world would it have gotten circulated in a geographic area like this? Okay, so it just seems improbable, but it should be noted You see Rome kind of above my head on the map up here behind you. We have evidence, like written evidence, of Clement of Rome, who's a Christian leader in 96 A.D., and for all intents and purposes, he quotes in a strongly, it's a little bit paraphrased, but it's right out of James chapter 4, verse 1, in his letter to the Corinthians in A.D. 96, the church in Corinth. And so we know that he had the book of James in his hand by A.D. 96 in Rome. And so that's just an interesting point. In the end, we don't know which group it was. We don't know who James was writing to specifically. We have a couple of different groups which might come to the top, but either group would have benefited greatly from the encouragement that James was giving them in this particular letter. Now, I want to stop here and kind of shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about this idea of James, the brother of Jesus. What do we really know about this James? Now, he is mentioned at a couple of places, and what I hope to do here with the remainder of our time is just kind of walk through some of the things that we find in Scripture that references James, the brother of Jesus. Now, Mark mentions the family of Jesus kind of in passing in a narrative in Luke chapter 4, when the people in Jesus' hometown of Nazareth are rejecting the idea that Jesus is the Messiah. They're rejecting the idea that he is fulfilling this Old Testament promise. And Mark says that they make a point about the fact that they know Jesus' family, and he lists that in there. And we see in this passage, they say, isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And aren't his sisters here with us? And so they were offended by him. And so we have this listing, this record of Jesus' family. Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters, because the word is plural there, right? And since Jesus was born of Mary while she was a virgin, 2 interpretations have arisen from the relationship of these siblings to Jesus. Now, the first of these is that they were stepchildren brought from Joseph from a previous marriage. Okay, this would mean that Joseph was older. He had these kids in his first marriage. Something happened to his wife, and she had died. But he needed a woman, a wife, a mom in the household, and so he remarried this young girl, maybe as young as 15. Okay, Mary might have been very young, and so these are stepchildren then, which would make them step siblings of Jesus. Probably significantly older than Jesus, right? Now, one of the difficulties we have is trying to place this group of older children into the birth narratives that we have in the New Testament. So, for example, when they go down to do the registration, okay, for the tax purposes to the hometown, they have to go to Bethlehem. It probably would have been required that Joseph had brought all of his children down there to make sure that they were registered for this tax, that they were included on the tax roll somewhere. When he fled with Mary and Jesus and went to Egypt and just camped out and lived in Egypt for, really, we kind of have an unknown period of time there. It might have been as long as a year or 2 years that he was down in Egypt waiting for Herod the Great to die. What was going on with these other children at that particular point? And so it's just difficult to work them into the narrative from the Gospels that we have about Jesus, if they're older kids, if they're the step siblings. Now, the other possibility is that these are children that are born of Mary after she had given birth to Jesus, and that would make all of them younger than Jesus, and that would give them the half-brother, half-sister relationship. So you have a step-sibling or you have the half-sibling possibility in there, where the common, Joseph is kind of the common father through that deal. Not disputing the miraculous birth of Jesus at that point. I'm just saying from the public perception that they would have been children of Mary. Now, neither interpretation affects the idea of a virgin birth, but the second one of these, since James is mentioned all the way to the end of the book of Acts, it's more likely that he is younger than Jesus rather than being significantly older than Jesus. It is important to note in John 7:5, it says that not even Jesus' brothers believed in him. They didn't really believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And so you have this group of brothers, potentially younger than Jesus. They're children of Joseph and Mary after Jesus has been born. And in that process, as he fulfills his calling to be the Messiah, as he gets to that adulthood age, they don't see the fact that he probably is the Messiah. Now, it's worth noting that James is mentioned first amongst all these siblings, and probably by biblical standards, that would indicate that he's the eldest of these siblings. And an interesting bit of history that's shared by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is that Jesus makes a resurrection appearance to James. So we see in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, "And that he appeared to Cephas," which would be Peter, and then to the 12, and then he appeared to over 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of them still alive, but some have fallen asleep. All right, so already some of the eyewitnesses have died off. And then he appeared to James, and then to all of the apostles. So we see in this passage, this resurrection appearance, it seems likely to be the point of conversion for James. Jesus appears to him. He didn't believe while Jesus was alive, but when Jesus appeared to him after he had risen from the dead, James then believed. And so when might James have risen to this prominence in the church in Jerusalem that he had as the leader in the church of Jerusalem? So let's just kind of think back through the history of Acts, and let's just kind of think about some things going on and see where we might place James in some of those narratives that we're really familiar with. So in Acts chapter 1, there was a call for names to be submitted for someone to replace Judas so that they still had 12 apostles. And the names that were submitted, James's name is not submitted in that list. Not surprising, given the fact that James is practically a brand new believer at that point. And one of the criteria had to be that this was a person who had been with Jesus since the beginning, had heard all of his teachings and witnessed all of the miracles that he had done. And because of James's unbelief and his lack of connection to the ministry of Jesus during that point, that would have disqualified him from this particular instance. Another key moment in the book of Acts is Acts chapter 6, where they're looking for 7 men who are full of wisdom and the Holy Spirit, to deal with this problem of the food distribution to the widows. And again, James's name doesn't come up in Acts chapter 6. But this is not surprising, since all of the men who were appointed had Greek-sounding names, and so it looks as though the church in Acts chapter 6 chose people from the group that had been disparaged by the food distribution to the widows, the Hellenistic-speaking widows, and they put those people in charge of fixing this particular problem. That would have disqualified James as well. Now, James is first mentioned in Acts chapter 12. All right, in verse 17, let me throw that up on the screen for you. It says, motioning to them with his hand to be silent, though, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of prison. Tell these things to James and the brothers, he said, and then he left and went to another place. Now, the context for this is that James, the brother of John, has just been put to death by Herod Agrippa I, and he arrests Peter when he saw that it pleased the Jews, and he decided in his own mind that after this feast, whatever this feast was, that they were going to put Peter to death as well. The Lord intervenes. You had a group in a house which were praying for Peter, for the Lord to do something mighty, and God sends an angel. Angel gets Peter out of prison. Peter goes, knocks on the house of the store. Rhoda thinks it's his ghost, and eventually, though, Peter convinces him that it is really him, and this is his instructions. He says, tell these things to James and the brothers. So evidently, by Acts chapter 12, James has already arisen to this position of leadership in the church at Jerusalem. Now, we see James, the just, mentioned again in 2 other places in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 15 and Acts chapter 21. And in that process, let me just stop for a moment and go back and mention the fact that we know that because Herod Agrippa I died in AD 45, according to Roman records, which Luke records right there in Acts chapter 12. We can date this point where James is already a leader of the church in Jerusalem to Acts chapter 12 in AD 45. Interesting point. Now, let's start with the Jerusalem Council. And they have this issue, what are they going to do with the Gentiles who are coming into the church? And they talk back and forth. And it says in verse 13, after they stopped speaking, it says, James responded, and brothers and sisters, listen to me. And he says a few things going on there. And then we pick up again in verse 19. It says, therefore, in my judgment, he said, we should not cause difficulties for those among the Gentiles who turn to God. But instead, we should write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from eating anything that has been strangled, and from blood. For since ancient times, Moses has had those who proclaim him in every city, and every Sabbath day he is read aloud in the synagogues. He's talking about the synagogues in these other places, right? Now, James's judgment carried weight. And his decision pleased the entire group. If you look in verse 25, it says they unanimously, were endorsing what James had to say here. And his words seem to have settled the matter for everybody, including the circumcision party, at least for the time. Now, again, in Acts chapter 21, we see James mentioned specifically, and this is the last time that we're going to see him mentioned in the book of Acts. And this is where Paul has come. This is right before Paul gets arrested in the temple, and he starts these series of trials, which kind of close out the book of Acts. But he goes to James. He brings the offering that they had collected to support the church in Jerusalem. It says the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. Now, Luke tracks this discussion in Acts 21 as if it's the entire group of elders who are speaking and not just James. But James here is singled out, particularly again, separate from the rest of them. And unfortunately, when we look at this whole process, none of the elders stood up. During the trial at the Sanhedrin, when Paul was taken, he was arrested in the temple. He was charged with bringing a Gentile in. The Romans intervened, keep him from killing him on the spot. He has a trial at the Sanhedrin, and neither James nor any of the elders nor the four men that he went into the temple with stood up to say, hey, wait, guys, no. This is what was going on. We're not Gentiles. He came into the temple with us. Now, perhaps we can see why they didn't do this just a few years later. Now, James is put to death, and this is what Josephus has to say in his Antiquities book, where he's talking about the history of the Jews, right? He's put to death by the Sadducees in AD 62 as the leader of the church in Jerusalem for his faith in Jesus. And James is mentioned by name, and the high priest Ananias, who seizes an opportunity between procurators, right, in Judea, the governing Roman person over Judea. There's a transition there between Felix and Albinus, and the high priest seizes this opportunity to put him to death. And you can see there, I just put the quote up there by them, and you can see that he mentions specifically Albinus as he comes in, and we can date Albinus, the year he started. He was on his way to Jerusalem to be procurator, and we can date that from Roman records to AD 62, which means we can date the death of James to AD 62. Now, let's look at the passage I told you earlier. This is where Paul talks about James in the book of Galatians. He's talking about his conversion. He's talking about his introduction to the faith and where he learned what he learned about the gospel. He says, after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to get to know Cephas, that's Peter, and I stayed with him for 15 days, but I didn't see any of the other apostles except for James, the Lord's brother, right? And then if we look again and another passage in James, in the next chapter, James chapter 2, verse 9, and then James, Cephas, and John, those who are recognized as pillars, right? Pillars of the church of Jerusalem, acknowledged the grace that had been given to me. They gave the right hand of fellowship to me and to Barnabas, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles, and they would go to the circumcised. And then a little bit further down in chapter 2, it says that when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned, for he regularly ate with the Gentiles before certain men came from James. However, when they came, he withdrew and separated himself because he feared those from the circumcision party. And, James is so identified with the church in Jerusalem. He doesn't say they came from the church in Jerusalem. These are men who came from James. And I don't know that James sent them up there to cause problems specifically. That doesn't seem to be the reputation that we have of him from Acts chapter 15. But it does show how James is at the core of the church. So we have this brother of Jesus named James who comes to faith through a resurrection appearance of Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15, right after his death, somewhere, let's just say around AD 30. We don't know what year that was exactly. He's martyred. He's put to death in AD 62. So there's a 32-year ministry, perhaps, or a lifespan of James after he comes to faith. He's put to death then by Ananias the high priest as Albinus is on. Now we see him as the lead elder, the leader of the church in Jerusalem by AD 45. That's the year that Herod Agrippa I died. And it's roughly about 15 years after his conversion. So about 15 years after the resurrection of Jesus, if it's about 30, somewhere in there. So let's say 12 to 15 years, depending on where you're going to date the death of Jesus. In that 12 to 15 year time frame, he's gone from new believer to leader of the church in Jerusalem. Now, somewhere in these 12 years between Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 12, James has matured in his faith, and he's risen to this lead position, and everyone's kind of looking to James then for wisdom and direction. It's difficult for us to see that James had the authority to write a letter like the book of James before he becomes leader of the church in Jerusalem. And that's why we're dating the book of James somewhere between 40 and 44, because we know he's already solid as the leader by 45. Okay? An interesting point to ponder is that the book of James is not written by an apostle. It's not written by somebody who was a disciple of an apostle, like Luke was to Paul or Mark perhaps was to Peter, but it is written by someone who grew up with Jesus and lived with him for a long time in this household. It's written by a man that we might have considered today to be a relatively new believer, someone who might have only been a new believer for 12 or 15 years, been a follower of Christ for that time, but someone who in those years has absorbed a great deal of Jesus's teaching, because again we see these parallels from the Sermon on the Mount that just kind of ooze out in the language of the book of James. As we look at the story of James as revealed by Luke and Paul, we see a guy who's looking for balance, not only between the traditional Jewish Christians and the Hellenistic Jewish Christians, and we see that tension going on in Acts chapter 6, but he's looking to deal with this tension between Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians as well. And this is why I think we see him in Acts 15 disagreeing with the idea that the Gentiles need to be circumcised in order to be a part of the church. But on the other hand, in Acts 21, we see him encouraging Paul to publicly display his Jewishness by going into the temple with these 4 young men and paying for their sacrifices and the cost for them to kind of complete their vows together. James died somewhere around right at 62 AD at the hands of the high priest. But Jerusalem itself is destroyed 8 years later in 70 AD at the hands of the Romans. And so when the church is dispersed then and Jerusalem is destroyed, the church in Jerusalem effectively ceases to exist. And the weight of the Great Commission, the weight of Jesus' commission to our churches shifts from its center of gravity being in the church in Jerusalem to the churches that were dispersed, like Philip was in Caesarea and the church in Antioch, but also to the churches that Paul planted and the churches that were started by other individuals, like the church in Rome. We don't know who started the church in Rome, because when Paul writes to it, he indicates that he's never been there before, but he wants to come to see them. And so you just have this shift of the responsibility for the Great Commission that takes place at this particular time when the church in Jerusalem ceases to exist in 70 AD. Lord bless you as you study the book of James. And I pray that it profits not only your congregation as you preach and teach through it, but it profits you personally as well.